Chapter 1. The offer. He invited me to breakfast like it was nothing. Neutral ground. Public place. White linen tablecloths and quiet piano covers in the background. The kind of hotel restaurant where no one makes a scene, and deals get made over omelets. I showed up 10 minutes early. He was already seated. Edward Langford didn't do late, or equal footing. He didn't offer his hand when I approached, just gestured to the seat across from him like a man who'd already decided how the conversation would go. "Appreciate you coming, Ethan," he said, folding his menu without looking at it. "I know how busy you must be." I smiled politely. "Tessa said you wanted to talk." I assumed that meant something important. His mouth twitched. Almost a smile. Almost. The server arrived. Coffee, black, for both of us. He didn't ask if I wanted anything else. He waited until she was gone before speaking again. "I've been watching you." I raised an eyebrow. "That so?" "I don't mean that in a hostile way," he said quickly, waving off the implication. "It's just when your only daughter gets serious about someone, you do your homework." I leaned back slightly. "You could have just asked me." "I'm not interested in what you'd say. I'm interested in what's real." He reached down into his briefcase and pulled out a small envelope, slid it across the table. "I'm going to make this simple." I didn't touch it, just looked at him, and waited. "That's 50,000, he said. "Tax-free. No strings, except one." I stared at the envelope, then back at him. "You want me to walk away?" "I want my daughter to live the life she's meant for. One without complications, without headlines, without someone whose name won't ever belong in ours." There it was, the polished, transactional rejection. A bribe dressed up as benevolence. Edward Langford didn't yell. He signed checks. I picked up the envelope, turned it once in my hands, then set it down again, untouched. "You think I'm for sale?" I said. "No," he replied smoothly. "I think everyone has a number. I just chose a generous starting point." I smiled, not because I agreed, but because in that moment something clicked. He thought this was a solution, but it was a receipt. Chapter 2. The doubt. Tessa didn't know about the breakfast. Not yet. She was at work by the time I left the restaurant, probably in her studio sketching out the next wave of packaging for that boutique skincare line she'd helped launch. She had no idea her father had just tried to cut me out of her life like a bad investment. And the worst part? A sliver of doubt had already crept in, before I even slid my key into our front door. That's how men like Edward Langford operated. They didn't scream. They didn't threaten. They planted questions, quietly, strategically, and then they stepped back to let those questions fester. I stepped into the apartment and closed the door behind me, but it didn't feel like home. Not in that moment. Not while I was still carrying the weight of the envelope, even though I'd left it behind. I sat down on the edge of the couch, still in my blazer, and stared at the coffee table. Did she know? Had she been warned? Had she smiled at me last night with full knowledge that her father was planning to pay me off the next morning? I hated that the questions were there. Hated that I couldn't immediately dismiss them. Tessa wasn't like him. She didn't operate in shadows or speak in power plays, but she was still his daughter. And that meant, whether she wanted to admit it or not, she'd been raised in a world where control looked like care, where love came with a dollar sign and a deadline. My phone buzzed. Her name lit up the screen. Tessa. "Hey babe, thinking Greek for dinner? I'll grab from Mythos on the way home unless you have a craving." I stared at the message longer than I needed to. There was nothing in it. No subtext. No clues. Just her. Cheerful. Normal. Still thinking this day was like any other. I typed back. "Mythos sounds good. Get extra pita?" It was easier than starting a fire I couldn't yet control. But deep down, something was shifting. Not just in how I saw her father, but in how I saw us. Because if Edward thought he could just erase me from her life like a typo, then maybe he didn't know his daughter as well as he believed. And maybe, just maybe, she didn't know him either. Chapter 3. The Ultimatum. The second meeting wasn't polite. It happened 5 days after the envelope. I hadn't told Tessa. Not yet. I'd hoped it would be a one-time flex, Edward trying to scare me off like some insecure boy playing gatekeeper. But men like him don't take silence as a no. They take it as a negotiation. This time, it wasn't over brunch. It was in his office. And I wasn't invited. I was summoned. I walked into Langford Capital's towering glass fortress in Midtown, wearing the same tailored navy suit I always wore for client meetings. The receptionist's smile faltered when I said my name, like she knew something I didn't. She handed me a visitor badge. "Mr. Langford is waiting on the top floor." Of course he was. The elevator opened into a suite that looked more like a private museum than a workspace. Floor-to-ceiling windows, original roncos, brushed steel everything. Edward sat at a desk the size of a runway, flanked by two associates who didn't bother introducing themselves. He didn't stand. "Mr. Miles," he said as if we'd never met. "You didn't take the offer. I assumed perhaps you needed time to reconsider." "I didn't need time," I said evenly. "I needed distance. You misunderstand. This isn't personal. It's protection. My daughter has a future, and I intend to preserve it. That future does not include someone with your background." I didn't take the bait. He was trying to draw blood, throwing shade at my upbringing, my lack of legacy, the absence of Ivy on my resume. "What exactly do you want from me, Edward?" He leaned forward. "I want you to walk away before this escalates. If you don't, I'll have no choice but to involve others." "What others?" He smiled like a wolf. "Clients, partners, the firms you contract with. You're independent, Mr. Miles. Vulnerable. It wouldn't take much to plant concern." "So that's the plan? Blackmail me out of your daughter's life?" He shrugged. "Call it what you like. I'm giving you an off-ramp, one that won't leave you in pieces." I stared at him, then looked at the two men beside him, silent, still, waiting for me to flinch. But I didn't. I straightened my cuff and nodded. "Thanks for the clarity." I said, "I'll make sure my next invoice reflects the full cost of your concern." Chapter 4. The Invoice. By the time I stepped back out onto the sidewalk, the wind had picked up. It whipped between the glass towers like it was trying to tell me something. Loud, chaotic, unrelenting. Same as Edward Langford's threats. But threats don't move me. Terms do. If he wanted to play contract hardball, then he picked the wrong strategist to push. I didn't go back to my apartment. I went to my office, a small two-room suite I shared with a paralegal and a very loyal assistant named Rena, who'd been with me since day one. She raised an eyebrow when she saw me walk in, jaw tight. "You look like someone just offered to buy your soul," she said, sipping coffee. "Worse, they tried to short sell it." I set my bag down, powered up my laptop, and pulled open the client file I'd been keeping in a separate folder for months, marked Langford Holdings, Informal. I hadn't signed anything with Edward yet. He'd never made it official. But unofficially, I'd been consulting with one of his subsidiaries through a joint referral project, an arrangement he was too arrogant to recognize as a legal entry point. That was his first mistake. His second, threatening me with planting concern among clients who already knew my track record was bulletproof. And now I had a reason to formalize everything. Rena leaned in. "You're doing the thing again." "What thing?" "The paperwork revenge face." I grinned. In less than an hour, I'd built a brand new engagement proposal, perfectly structured, scope detailed, legally sound. It outlined advanced restructuring services, image rehabilitation strategies, and a deliverables calendar so aggressive it practically screamed executive lifeline. I addressed it not to Edward directly, but to the board liaison at Langford Holdings, who'd been silently copying me on emails for weeks. The kind of person who noticed inefficiency and power plays. I titled the doc, "Strategic Intervention and Turnaround Proposal, Fee Schedule Attached." The cost, double my standard rate, no discount, no waiver, full payment due on signature, plus a confidentiality clause buried so deep it would take a litigation team to unspool it. He wanted to throw money at the problem? Let's make sure it hurt. Rena whistled when she saw the bottom line. "That's a hell of a number." "Not really," I said. "It's just the price of disrespect." Chapter 5. The Agreement. The signature came faster than I expected. 2 days after I sent the proposal, an encrypted email hit my inbox from Langford Holdings legal counsel. Attached was a PDF, executed, time-stamped, watermarked. Subject, fully executed contract, strategic intervention agreement. I didn't smile. I studied it. Every clause I'd buried in that document had been accepted. No red lines, no requests for clarification, no questions about the payment schedule. Just a silent acknowledgement that they were officially in trouble, and desperate enough to reach for anything that looked like control, including me. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was now on contract to fix the very empire whose king had just tried to shove me off the board. Rena brought in 2 coffees when she saw the look on my face. "Is it done?" "It's signed," she smirked. "He just hired the man he tried to erase." I nodded, staring down at the screen. He doesn't realize yet what he's agreed to. The deal looked normal on the surface, an engagement for strategic operations review and media stabilization across 2 high-risk Langford subsidiaries. But what Edward hadn't seen, or hadn't bothered to read, was that I now had authorized access to internal audits, board meeting minutes, and client churn reports. Full transparency, legal and binding. And I wasn't just helping them look good on paper. I was auditing the root rot. Later that evening, I got a call from Tessa. "You've been quiet lately," she said. "Everything okay with work?" I paused. Do I tell her? Do I admit her father offered me 50 grand to vanish? Then threaten my career, then after I refused, unknowingly put me on payroll? Or do I wait? Because what I wanted wasn't just to expose Edward. I wanted to expose the culture he built, the people he protected, the games he played behind mahogany doors. "Everything's fine," I said gently. "Just juggling a lot of projects." She laughed. "You always are. You're like a machine." "No," I said softly. "Just very, very focused." And I was. Focused on the long arc of the play. Because Edward had just handed me the keys to the engine room, and I was going to show him exactly what happened when you build your empire on arrogance, and then pay your enemy to walk right in. Chapter 6. The Realization. It started with little things. Tessa grew quiet whenever her father's name came up. She didn't defend him. She didn't criticize him either. She just stalled, changed the subject, asked if I wanted more wine, or if we should finally book that weekend trip to Lake George. She was shielding me, or maybe shielding herself, but something had shifted. And when I came home one night and found her sitting on the couch with her laptop open, red-rimmed eyes scanning a PDF of corporate bylaws I hadn't shown her, I knew the dam had cracked. "Where did you get that?" I asked. She didn't look up. "Board docs," she murmured. "Public companies have filings. Langford Holdings isn't public, but their partners are, and some of their co-funded projects have oversight requirements." I blinked. "You went digging." Her eyes finally met mine. "I know you haven't told me everything. I can feel it. The way you come home wired but quiet. The way you hesitate when I ask about your day. And now I know why." I sat across from her. "Tessa, my father threatened you, didn't he?" I didn't answer. That was answer enough. She closed her laptop slowly. Her voice dropped. "How long?" I exhaled. "He tried to buy me off a week and a half ago. Then he tried to scare me. And now he's paying me, through his board, for consulting." "You took the contract?" I held her gaze. "I wrote the contract." Her expression shifted. Conflict, betrayal, then something else. Understanding, sadness. She folded her hands in her lap like she needed them to stay still. "I always knew he could be controlling, but I didn't know he'd weaponize it like this." "He sees you as an asset," I said gently. "Not a person." She nodded slowly. "And I've spent most of my life trying not to see that." I reached for her hand. She let me take it. "What do you want to do?" I asked. "I want the truth," she said. "All of it. If he's hurting people, if he's manipulating investors, if he's coming after you, I want it in the light." I studied her, the resolve in her voice, the grief sitting behind it. "You sure?" She nodded. "He taught me how to stand tall. But he never expected I'd use it against him." Chapter 7. The Flip. By the following week, Edward's tone had changed. He wasn't warmer, just quieter, less bluster. No more veiled threats about my reputation or what clients might think. Instead, I got crisp one-line emails asking for clarification on deliverables, requests to expedite timelines, a sudden interest in performance metrics. He was feeling the heat. He just didn't know where it was coming from yet. Langford Holdings had made the mistake of pushing quarterly reports without auditing the foundation. The foundation, it turned out, had rot in every corner. Red flag vendor relationships, project timelines that didn't line up with financial outflows, shell companies with vague service descriptions, and strangely uniform invoice totals. And best of all, I had full access. By contract, his signature. Rena walked into my office that Friday, a grin tugging at her mouth. "You're not going to believe this," she said, waving a manila folder like it was a golden ticket. "We just got a request from Langford senior staff to expand your scope to include their reputation recovery unit." I blinked. "He's expanding my access? Not just expanding it, fast-tracking it. They want you in meetings starting Monday." I sat back, staring at the folder in her hand. Edward was flipping. Not because he trusted me, because he realized he needed me. He was bleeding somewhere behind the scenes. Maybe it was a board member asking too many questions. Maybe a partner with cold feet. Maybe even someone on the inside who didn't like how the money moved. Whatever it was, he'd miscalculated. He thought hiring me would contain the problem. Instead, I became the problem, just disguised in a tailored suit and bulletproof clauses. That night, I poured 2 glasses of wine and handed one to Tessa on the balcony. "They want me in the room now," I said. "The big room." She took the glass, her fingers brushing mine. "Good. You okay with that?" She nodded. "He used to tell me pressure reveals character. Maybe it's time someone applied some." I smiled. "Your father's going to hate this." "Probably." She looked out at the skyline. "But that's not my problem anymore." Chapter 8. The Exposure. I didn't expect the leak to come from inside the room. But in retrospect, it made sense. Edward had spent so many years cloaking himself in power that he'd stopped seeing the people beneath him. Assistants, analysts, junior partners, disposable in his eyes, dangerous in mine. The meeting that morning was supposed to be routine. Just another strategy session with Langford Holdings' senior team. We gathered around the long obsidian table, a row of branded water bottles and neutral expressions, while Edward walked us through image rehabilitation strategies like he was narrating a hostage negotiation. He barely glanced at me until I opened the folder. Inside, a list of transactions routed through an intermediary vendor that, on paper, provided brand consulting. In reality, they were a shell for political donations, made in ways that violated Langford Holdings' internal ethics guidelines. I didn't say a word. I just slid the paper across the table to Edward. Slowly, deliberately. He stared down at it for a long time. His jaw clenched, but he said nothing. No one else in the room moved, except one man, Ryan, the junior associate who handled project metrics. I saw his eyes flick to the document, then to Edward, then back again. A single bead of sweat broke across his temple, and just like that, I knew. Ryan had already seen this, and he hadn't kept it to himself. The next morning, a recording dropped. Audio only, muffled at first, then clear. Edward's voice, sharp, dismissive. "I don't care what the board says, you make that report vanish. I built this company, and no clipboard watchdog's going to sink it over a few discretionary transfers." It was unmistakable. The file hit 3 finance blogs before noon. 2 more business watchdogs picked it up by the end of the day. By that evening, the clip had over 800,000 views on TikTok. Spliced with photos of Edward's face under the caption, "When the boss forgets the intern has AirPods." I didn't post it. I didn't need to. He'd made too many enemies to trace the leak. And now, his empire was burning from the inside. I watched the clip on my phone, volume low, as I sat beside Tessa on the couch. She said nothing, but I saw her eyes drink to the screen, and then to me. "You didn't record that," she said. "Nope, but you knew it would come." I met her gaze. I built the fireproof frame. Someone else lit the match. Chapter 9, The Fallout. The board didn't waste time. By Monday morning, Langford Holdings announced an emergency governance review. A press release framed it as proactive, routine, nothing more than a scheduled audit pushed up for convenience. But inside the firm, it was chaos. 2 high-profile investors suspended their funding commitments. A third demanded their contract be renegotiated. And behind closed doors, a quiet vote was circulating, one that spelled trouble not just for Edward's title, but for the very structure he'd built. He tried to rally, of course, sent a message to the senior team calling the leak a strategic smear campaign, claimed it was orchestrated by a rival firm, even hinted that I might be involved, which frankly would have been flattering if it hadn't been so desperate. The truth was simpler. Someone finally saw an opening, and they took it. I spent most of that day meeting with damage control consultants, quietly steering conversations, reviewing financial transparency policies. My contract made me the authority now. His own signature had ensured it. Around 3 p.m., I got a text. Tessa, he called me, said you poisoned the company, said you turned me against him. I stared at the screen, then typed back. Me, did you believe him? The three dots blinked, then stopped, then blinked again. Finally, her reply. Tessa, no. I just didn't realize how many people he'd buried to stay on top. That night, she came by the office. She stood in the doorway for a long time before speaking. I listened to the rest of the clip, she said. There's more than just arrogance in his voice. There's fear. He knows what's coming. She walked in, sat across from me. I think I'm ready to tell the board what I know. I looked up. You're sure? Her eyes were steady. He tried to turn me into a chess piece. And you? He underestimated you. Again. I smiled faintly. He's made a habit of that. She leaned forward. Then let's break the habit. Chapter 10. The Walkaway. The boardroom was quiet when Tessa walked in. Not dramatic quiet. Tense quiet. That thin, corporate kind of silence where no one knows who's about to get cut. And everyone's praying it's not them. Edward was already seated. Pinstripe suit flawless. Face unreadable. But the fatigue was showing. His tie was loose. His cufflinks mismatched. One small tell after another, like the empire was unraveling, and he was the last one to notice. Tessa didn't sit. She stood behind the chair meant for her, spine straight, chin high. My father told you I was just here to observe, she said. That's not true. I'm here to clarify something. Edward shifted. Tessa, not now. No, she said. Now. She turned to the board. You've all seen the headlines, heard the audio, read the leak memos. What you haven't seen is what it's cost everyone else. People whose careers he threatened, whose reputations he tried to smear, including Ethan. A few heads turned my way. I said nothing. My father taught me to lead, she continued, but he never showed me what integrity looked like. Not until I saw what Ethan was willing to risk just to tell the truth. Edward stood now too. This is a loyalty test. You're choosing a man you barely know, she cut in, voice steady. I'm choosing who I am. She reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. Here's my statement. The dates I was told to avoid certain meetings. The ones where he pushed through unethical practices without full votes. I may not be on this board, but I won't be a shield for what he's done. Edward's face collapsed, rage barely suppressed beneath polished features. This is betrayal, he spat. No, she said softly. This is the invoice. We left the building without a word. No dramatic standoff, no mic drop, just the click of shoes on marble tile, and the soft hiss of elevator doors closing behind us. Outside, the air felt different, lighter. Tessa exhaled. It's over. Almost, I said. There's just one more thing. I reached into my jacket and pulled out the final letter. The termination clause. My contract, fully satisfied. Exit clause enacted. Effective immediately. I handed it to the front desk on the way out. Edward thought he could buy me off. Instead, he funded his own downfall. Chapter 11, The Reckoning Begins. The next morning, Edward Langford's name vanished from the company directory. No announcement, no press release. Just gone. His executive profile redirected to a 404 error. His parking spot was empty. His calendar had been wiped. It was the kind of erasure that only happens when a company wants someone forgotten, not just removed. I didn't ask who made the final call. I already knew. The board had convened without him, late the previous night. Tessa was invited as a witness. I wasn't in the room, but I got the summary from Rena, who heard it from an insider, who owed her more than one favor. It hadn't been a debate. The board already had a replacement in mind. Someone clean, someone corporate, someone they could mold, but not someone connected to the Langford legacy. That part of the dynasty, it was over. Officially, Edward had stepped down. Unofficially, he'd been escorted out of the building at 11:13 p.m. Tessa showed up at my office the next afternoon. She looked different, lighter, like someone who'd finally stopped holding her breath. They sent him home with a severance clause, she said, dropping into the chair across from me. Minimal, symbolic, just enough to keep him from suing. Will he? He might try, but they have recordings, memos, my statement. She pulled out her phone and scrolled. And this. It was a text from Edward. You chose wrong. This won't end well for either of you. I read it twice. He's still swinging. Not for long, she said. I watched her tuck the phone away and realized something had shifted. Not just with Edward, but with Tessa. She wasn't the daughter shielding the family name anymore. She was someone else now, someone sharper, freer. "I'm thinking of launching something," she said after a moment. "Not a firm, a foundation. For whistleblowers and ethics compliance teams. Start small, build slow." I raised an eyebrow. "That's a pivot." She smiled. "It's a clean break." A pause stretched between us, quiet, but full of something solid. Mutual understanding, mutual respect. Something new rising from everything that had burned. Outside, a new name was being engraved on the office placard where Edward Langford's had once been. And inside, the man he'd tried to erase was still standing. Chapter 12. What he left behind. Edward Langford didn't vanish overnight, but the world around him made sure he faded fast. At first, the media flurry was relentless. Speculation, accusations, half-hearted defenses from former colleagues who now claimed they'd always seen the writing on the wall. Some stories painted him as a misunderstood mogul brought down by shifting corporate winds. Others dug deeper, tracing his fall to misused power, intimidation tactics, and the moment someone dared to say, "Enough." Within weeks, his name stopped trending. He retreated to a rented property just north of the city. No driver, no staff, no cameras. The kind of place built for disappearing. I heard from someone in legal that his attempt to file suit against the board was denied pre-arbitration. Not because he didn't have lawyers, but because he didn't have leverage. The man who once controlled the room now couldn't even control his own narrative. Meanwhile, Langford Holdings was undergoing a quiet reconstruction. Not the kind that made headlines, something subtler. Day by day, meeting by meeting, the culture shifted. Outdated departments were dissolved. The leadership roster was revised. For the first time in years, people actually spoke freely in hallways. I watched Rena present a new compliance protocol with more authority than any director ever gave her credit for. I saw 2 senior analysts, both women, get promoted to roles they'd been quietly passed over for again and again. A new voice was rising across every floor of the company, one not built on fear, but on proof, on presence, on persistence. As for me, I was invited to join the internal ethics committee. The irony didn't escape me. Months ago, I was the outsider, targeted, doubted, nearly erased. Now they wanted my blueprint on how to prevent another Langford from ever rising again. I wasn't sure if I'd stay. That was, until I saw what had replaced Edward's legacy plaque outside the main boardroom. It wasn't a portrait, no timeline of awards, just a single steel panel, clean and deliberate, with one line etched into its surface. "Reputation isn't what you say, it's what survives when you stop speaking." There was no author name attached, no company branding, but I knew exactly who was behind it. Tessa had donated the plaque herself, quietly, without fanfare. It was her last word on her father's legacy, a simple statement that stripped everything down to truth. We met for dinner a week later, no press, no pretense. She didn't ask how I was handling the aftermath. She didn't need to. Instead, she raised her glass, looked me square in the eye, and said, "Your board proposal was bold." I returned the gesture. It was overdue. Her smile was faint but firm. So are a lot of things. As I looked at her across the table, this woman who had once been a bystander in her father's empire and now stood firmly outside of its shadow, I realized something essential. This had never been about revenge. Not really. It was about redefinition, about reclaiming the narrative from the people who thought they controlled it. Edward had tried to name the price of my dignity. In the end, he paid for that mistake with his legacy. And what I left behind wasn't scorched earth. It was a foundation, clean, unshakable, and finally mine. Epilogue, the return email. The message came on a quiet Sunday. No subject line, just a sender, Edward Langford. For a second, I thought it might be spam, a phishing attempt, but the address checked out. And the tone? It was unmistakably him. "Ethan, I won't waste words. You played the long game. I underestimated you, clearly, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't see it coming, eventually. My daughter believes you're the better man. She may be right. You were never just after the company. You were after something harder to earn. Trust. Congratulations. You won. E. Langford." I read it once, then again, then closed my laptop. There was no reply, there wouldn't be, because it wasn't a peace offering. It was a confession. He'd finally understood what I'd done, not just to him, but around him. While he was trying to manipulate his daughter and stamp out any threat to his control, I was building something he couldn't touch, a foundation of credibility, client loyalty, and people who'd seen what real leadership looked like. Not brash, not controlling, just steady. Tessa never asked me to share the message with her. Maybe she sensed it wouldn't matter. She was already deep into planning her foundation, had secured nonprofit status, built a small advisory board, and started fielding grant requests. We were in different buildings now, different missions, but the same clarity. There are men who build legacies out of fear, and then there are those who build them out of fire, tempered, controlled, and unshakable. Edward Langford didn't know the difference, but when he finally looked up from the ruins, he knew which one I was.
Thanks so much for watching. If you love a good revenge story, or if you've ever dreamed of getting the last word without saying much at all, you're in the right place. Be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new savage ending. Because around here, karma always hits different.